The 2 a.m. silence of the Vanguard Defense and Logistics Global Command Center was a manufactured lie. The air was sterile, chilled to exactly 64 degrees, and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive desperation. On the primary wall screen, a 40-foot expanse of high-definition obsidian, a $500 million shipment of specialized medical isotopes, was represented by a single, pulsating red dot over the mid-Atlantic. It wasn't moving. The signal parity is gone. Marcus Thorne, the lead consultant from Blackwood Consulting, slammed his hand onto the glass console. He was 26, wore a slim-fit navy blazer, and was currently watching his reputation evaporate in real. The AI can't lock the telemetry. The handshake is recursive. If those isotope pods hit ambient temperature, we're looking at a radiological disaster. 6 optimization experts were frantically typing, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of failed simulations. They were fighting a digital ghost of phantom grid blackout that their textbook said was impossible. Elias Thorne walked through the heavy security doors. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a faded VDL work jacket with a grease-stained collar and carried a battered stainless steel thermos. He didn't look at the flashing red error codes. He walked past the high-tech workstations and stopped at the physical backlit weather map on the side wall. "You're chasing the wrong ghost," Marcus Elias said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to physically ground the room's mounting panic. Marcus didn't even turn around. "Stay in your lane, Elias. This is a level 5 architectural breach. You wouldn't even know how to log in." Elias took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He pointed a scarred, calloused finger at the tropospheric pressure lines on the Azores corridor. "The AI is hunting for a software handshake because you taught it to ignore latent signal noise. But the atmospheric ion density over the ridge is causing a refraction in your satellite uplink. Your code thinks it's a hack. The reality is just weather." He looked at the digital clock. "Reroute the packet stream to the kinetic subgrid now, or that cargo becomes radioactive waste in 10 minutes. Choose how you want to spend them." Expert Elias Thorne knew the one variable the experts had never been taught to see, and it was a secret that was about to break the world of Vanguard Defense. The 38th floor of Vanguard Defense and Logistics Headquarters didn't feel like a place where ships were managed or global supply chains were secured. It felt like a cathedral of glass and ego. The boardroom was a sterile expanse of polished mahogany and brushed steel, filtered to a temperature that was exactly 2 degrees too cold for human comfort. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the harbor was a chaotic gray blur of salt and industry. But in here, the air was clean, silent, and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and the ozone of high-end servers. Julian Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking less like a CEO and more like a predator in a tailored charcoal suit. At 29, he had inherited the company from his father 3 months earlier, and he had spent every hour since trying to erase the legacy of the man who had built it. To Julian, history was just friction. Experience was just another word, with 4 being slow. "Enter Elias," Julian said, his voice a sharp, clinical blade that cut through the silence. Elias Thorne stepped through the heavy glass doors. He was 52, but his shoulders carried the permanent set of a man who had spent 3 decades fighting the ocean and the machines that traversed it. He was a stark, jarring contrast to the room's clinical perfection. He wore a faded work jacket with a grease-stained collar and heavy leather boots that left faint, honest scuffs on the pristine Persian rug. In his hand, he carried a battered, leather-bound logbook, a physical record of every manual override and structural anomaly he had managed over the last 30 years. Julian looked at the logbook, then up at Elias with an expression of visceral, physical disgust, still carrying the diary. "I see," Julian mocked, gesturing toward the seat at the far end of the table. "I suppose it's hard to let go of the 19th century when you spent so much of it there." Elias didn't take the seat. He stood at the end of the table, his scarred knuckles resting on the wood. He didn't bow, he didn't smile. He stood with a heavy stoic presence that seemed to unsettle the 3 men sitting across from him. "This is the Blackwood team," Julian said, his eyes flicking toward the trio of young men in slim-fit blazers. They were the physical embodiment of the new Vanguard, all polished veneer and zero soil under their fingernails. They held encrypted tablets as if they were holy relics. "Marcus, Simon, and David. They are the optimization experts I told you about. They've spent the last month analyzing our infrastructure from their offices in Manhattan." Marcus, a lead consultant, didn't offer Elias a handshake. He just tapped his tablet, and a series of complex neon blue flowcharts projected onto the boardroom wall. "We've analyzed your current fleet management protocols," Mr. Thorne, Marcus said, his voice full of a clinical, manufactured certainty. "To put it bluntly, it's a liability. You rely on what you call intuitive logistics, manual backups, legacy overrides, and a reliance on human intuition that our data models show is 84% less efficient than a fully automated AI grid. Your navigator method is quaint, certainly, but it's a relic. It belongs in a museum. not in a billion-dollar supply chain. Julian laughed, a sharp, dry sound that echoed off the glass. That's the word of the day. Elias, you've spent 30 years at VDL. You're the old guard. But let's be honest, your yaklism approach is grease-stained. You represent the friction we're trying to eliminate. My father valued your gut feelings, but my father also liked paper maps and mechanical watches. I value results. Julian stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket, which cost more than Elias made in 6 months. He walked to the window, looking out at the shipyard. As if it were a chessboard he had already won. As of this morning, Julian continued, not looking back, Blackwood is in full control of the Global Command Center. Your services as fleet manager are no longer required. I'm clearing the deadwood, Elias. You're a relic of Emanuelia, and frankly, you're an embarrassment to the high-tech brand I'm building. Elias stood perfectly still. He felt the cold, concentrated fury of the board members sitting along the sides, men who had grown rich on Elias's expertise but were now too afraid of Julian's temper to speak. He looked at the logbook in his hand. He knew that inside this book were the manual failsafes for the very system Blackwood was about to optimize. The algorithm is only as good as the man who knows when to turn it off. Julian, Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble. Julian whipped around, his face snapping into a mask of concentrated cruelty. That's exactly the kind of dinosaur thinking that leads to stagnation. The machine doesn't need to be turned off. The machine is perfect. It's the man who's flawed. It's the man who gets tired, who gets sentimental, who gets grease on the Persian rug. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a low-frequency threat. I'm doing this for the company, but I'm also doing this for you. Go home, take your severance. Go play with your daughter. You've spent too long looking at rust to recognize the future. Security will escort you to the lockers. You have 1 hour to clear your desk. Try to leave the grease in the garage on your way out. Marcus Sinan and David didn't look up from their tablets. To them, Elias wasn't a man. He was a line item that had finally been deleted. Elias Thorne didn't argue. He didn't beg for the job he had worked for 3 decades. He simply picked up his leather logbook. He looked at Julian Sterling, a boy playing at being a king, and then at the experts, who had memorized the Thorne sequence but had never lived through the storms that created it. I hope your code can swim, Julian, Elias said quietly. He turned and walked toward the door, his heavy boots sounding like a countdown on the marble floor. He was being replaced by men who had never seen a ship sink, and he was being fired by a man who thought that the future was something you could buy. The mockery was complete. Julian Sterling thought he had established the hierarchy. He thought he had erased the friction. But as Elias stepped into the elevator, his eyes narrowing into a cold, lethal focus, he knew one thing the boardroom didn't. He knew that the North Atlantic was a place of physics, not philosophy. And he knew that when the noise finally stopped, Julian Sterling was going to find out that the dead wood was the only thing that could keep his empire from burning. The bus ride back to the Low District always felt like a slow descent from a mountain of glass into a valley of rust. Elias sat near the back, his tool bag between his boots, watching the city's skyline shift. The glittering spires of the V Empire faded, replaced by the gray, salt-eroded brick of the old shipping district. He didn't think about Julian Sterling's mocking laughter. He didn't think about the optimization experts who had looked at him like a museum exhibit. He thought about the numbers. $15,000. That was the gap. His house was a small, salt-stunted cottage on the edge of the shipyard, a structure of thick cedar and low ceilings that had weathered a century of North Atlantic gales. To the people in the boardroom, this place was a rounding error on a property tax map. To Elias, it was a sanctuary. You stepped inside, the heavy oak door thudding shut behind him. The air here didn't smell like ozone and filtered lilies. It smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and the honest, metallic scent of cedar. Dad, the voice was small, slightly labored, carrying the rhythmic hiss-click of a machine. Elias walked into the small kitchen. Maya was sitting at the table, her small frame swallowed by a thick, oversized wool sweater that had once belonged to her mother. She was 8, but she had a stillness in her eyes that belonged to someone much older. Beside her, a specialized medical nebulizer was humming a rhythmic, clinical sound that acted as a constant reminder of the secret burden Elias carried every single day. Maya had a rare respiratory condition, a legacy of the same coastal industrial fire that had taken Elias's wife, Sarah, 5 years earlier. It was a condition that required constant monitoring, specialized treatments, and a medicine that was priced like liquid gold. Elias walked over and kissed the top of her head. He felt a familiar, sharp ache in his chest. Depression or decompression chamber could ever bleed off. How's the breathing today, Maya? He asked, his voice dropping into a low, gentle rumble. The nest came, she said, her voice carrying a faint wheeze. She says I'm doing better, Dad, but I saw the invoice on the counter. The $15,000. Is that why you stayed late at the office? Elias felt the weight of the $15,000 treatment costs pressing against his ribs. He had spent 30 years building an empire, and now he was counting pennies to buy his daughter's breath. The secret burden. that the intelligence community and the high-tech firms whispered about. The reason the man who had been the primary architect of the VDL global grid was now pulling manual manifests in a shipyard lived in this kitchen 7 years ago. Elias Thorne hadn't been a fleet manager. He had been a legend known in the shadows of maritime intelligence as the Navigator. He had designed the very foundations of the global grid, a system so sophisticated it was considered the industry's gold standard. He had been a man of patents, six-figure bonuses, and a brilliant, laughing wife. But when Sarah died, Elias realized that the grid could run without him, but Maya couldn't. He took a dark step back, scrubbing his professional history and taking a low-level role to stay close to home. He had traded the executive suite for a life where he could be home every night to hold a nebulizer mask. He had traded his legacy for a life. He sat across from her, his large, scarred hands looking out of place against her small shoulders. He didn't mention being fired. He didn't mention Julian Sterling. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, flat wooden case. He opened the brass latches. Inside, resting on a bed of blue velvet, was an antique brass sextant. It was a tool of pure physics, a device that relied on the stars and the steel, not the code. Time for the lesson, Elias asked. Maya's eyes brightened, a spark of the reef blue depth that Sarah had given her. She reached for the sextant, her small fingers tracing the etched markings with a reverence that made Elias's throat tighten. "Why do we still use the stars, Dad?" she asked. Her voice hushed. "Marcus, the man from the center who came by last week, said that the GPS is 100 times more accurate. He said the sextant is just a toy for old people." Elias picked up the sextant. The brass was cold, a physical link to a past he had tried to outrun every single day. He watched the needle of the spirit-level tremor, searching for the true horizon, oblivious to this sterile high-tech world outside these walls. "The screen can lie to you, Maya," Elias said, his voice deep and steady. He placed the sextant in her hand and closed her fingers over it. "The computer is just a mirror reflecting what someone else wants you to believe. It's an opinion written in code. If the power goes out or the satellites blink, the screen goes black. Then you're truly lost." He leaned in, his voice dropping into the low-frequency rumble he had used to train a generation of master navigators. "But the stars don't have an agenda. They don't have a software update. They don't have an ego. And the steel of the ship beneath your feet, it doesn't care about your job title or your bank account. It only cares about the truth of the physics." He pointed to the etched arc of the sextant. "The smallest measurement, Maya, is often the difference between finding the harbor and being swallowed by the black. Most people in the boardroom look for the efficiency. They look for the fast way, the loud way, the way that looks best on a presentation. But a navigator looks for the right way. You have to find the true north before you can trust the light." He was teaching her how to survive in a world that was increasingly built on shadows and arrogant assumptions. He was working a job that treated him like trash so that she could have a world where she didn't have to be invisible. He didn't need Julian Sterling to know his name. He didn't need a title. He just needed Maya to keep her focus on the stars. As the night progressed, Elias watched his daughter fall asleep at the table, the brass sextant clutched in her hand like a holy relic. The nebulizer had finally stopped its rhythmic hiss-click. The silence was absolute, save for the distant, rhythmic thrum of a cargo ship leaving the harbor. Elias stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the VDL command center looming over the harbor like a predatory bird, its blue lights a cold, arrogant promise of a future without friction. He knew the Blackwood team was currently implementing a heuristic drift patch that would ignore the ion density fluctuations over the Azores. He knew they were removing the signal buffers to save a few pennies on satellite overhead. He knew the disaster was coming. He could feel it in the air the same way he could feel a change in the barometer before the storm hit for the first time. In 7 years, Elias Thorne felt the cold, hard weight of a decision. He had the $15,000 for Maya's medicine for this month. But the severance Julian had offered wouldn't last the year. He could stay in the shadows and let Julian's empire burn, or he could be the man Sarah wanted him to, be the one who saved the ship no matter who was at the wheel. He looked at Maya, her breathing slow and even for now. "The noise is about to stop, Sarah," he whispered to the empty room. He walked to his tool bag and pulled out the leather-bound logbook. He didn't need Julian's permission to be the navigator. He didn't need a seat at the mahogany table. He just needed to be there when the pressure hit. He picked up his sharpening stone and began to run it along the edge of his pocket knife. The rhythmic scritch, 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 a promise of what was coming. The experts were about to find out that the North Atlantic doesn't care about their Harvard degrees. It only cares about the truth. And Elias Thorne was the only man left who knew how to find it. The return to Vanguard Defense and Logistics was not a triumph. It was a clinical, bureaucratic necessity. The phone call had come at 4:15 a.m., 3 days after the board meeting. It wasn't Julian Sterling on the line, but a terrified HR coordinator, whose voice shook with the weight of a dozen unread emails from the National Health Authority. The optimization experts from Blackwood had successfully automated 80% of the manifest retrieval system. but they had hit a logic wall with the physical archives of 30 years of handwritten ledgers and manual overrides that Elias had maintained. They didn't want the navigator back. They wanted a librarian with grease under his fingernails. Elias walked into the command center. At 9 a.m. the space had been transformed into a white and white sanctuary of digital silence. The old paper charts were gone, replaced by interactive, holographic projections of the globe. The air was colder, smelling of ozone and the expensive leather of the Blackwood team's chairs. Elias was led not to his old office, but to a small, cluttered desk in the back corner, situated directly beneath a high-output air conditioning vent. He was a transition consultant, a title that carried less professional weight than the night security guard. His job was to sit in the shadows and provide contextual metadata for the digital migration. From his corner, Elias watched the future work. Marcus Thorne, the lead expert, was standing at the primary terminal, his face illuminated by a pulsating blue glow. He was flanked by Simon and David, the three of them moving with a synchronized, bloodless efficiency of men who believed that the world was a simulation they had already solved. "The Aegis update is live," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the practiced, calm authority of a man who had never seen a hurricane. "We're initiating the efficiency patch for the Atlantic corridor. By reducing the signal parity buffer by 60%, we're freeing up 4 terabytes of bandwidth. It's a clean $6 million saving on satellite overhead annually." Julian Sterling was standing behind them, his arms crossed, a smug smile of victory on his face. 6 million. That's the sound of the dead wood being cleared, isn't it? Marcus Elias looked at the screen from 40 feet away. He didn't need the holographic overlay. He looked at the raw telemetry data scrolling in the bottom left corner, thin stream of white text that the experts were ignoring in favor of the pretty, green graphs. He saw the shimmerette was a microscopic jitter in the signal return from the Azores relay station to the Blackwood model. It was just atmospheric noise, a variable that the AI was programmed to filter out. But Elias knew that shimmer, it was the heuristic drift, a physical phenomenon, where high-pressure ion density over the mid-Atlantic caused a refractive index shift in the satellite uplink. If they cut the buffer by 60%, the AI wouldn't optimize. It would go blind. It would lose the heartbeat of every ship in that corridor. Elias stood up. The movement was slow, heavy, and deliberate. He walked toward the primary terminal, his heavy boots sounding like a discordant drumbeat against the sterile silence of the room. He stopped at the edge of Marcus's circle. "You're ignoring the latent refraction over the Azores," Elias said. His voice wasn't the flat, anonymous rasp of a consultant. It was the steady, low-frequency rumble of a man who had spent 10,000 hours in the dark listening to the machine. Marcus didn't even turn around. He just tapped his tablet, his eyes fixed on the green graphs. "Mr. Thorne, I appreciate the fleet manager perspective, but the Aegis model uses a recursive algorithm to account for atmospheric variables. It's already compensated for the ion density. The algorithm is compensating for a software model," Elias countered, stepping closer. "But the reality is physical. You've got a thermal inversion layer building at 30,000 feet. Your refractive index is shifting toward the infrared. If you cut the buffer now, your AI will enter a parity loop. It will lose the isotope pods." Julian Sterling stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Elias, you were hired to find manifests, not to provide unsolicited engineering advice. Marcus has a PhD in logistics architecture. He studied the Thorne sequence at Harvard." Marcus finally turned, a thin, mocking smile on his lips. "That's actually the point, Mr. Sterling. The Thorne sequence, which is the industry standard, states that signal parity can be reduced in high-stability corridors to maximize throughput. I wrote my dissertation on it. I think I understand the Thorne sequence better than a man who still uses a brass sextant to find his way to the kitchen." The irony was a physical weight in Elias's chest. The Thorne sequence was his own creation, proto he had designed 20 years ago to protect Sarah and the crew of the Sarah Jane during the 2004 hurricane season. He had named it after her, and now these men were using his own name as a weapon to dismantle the very safety nets he had built with his blood. "The Thorne sequence isn't about throughput, Marcus," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's about the zero-fail margin. If you hit an ion density spike during a thermal inversion, the parity loop isn't a suggestion, it's a terminal failure. You're trying to run a marathon on a tightrope, and you've just told the acrobat he doesn't need his balance bar. The Aegis model doesn't fall, Elias," Marcus mocked, turning back to the screen. "It evolves. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a future to build. Try not to trip over the cables on your way back to the archives." The command center erupted into a low, sycophantic murmur of laughter. Julian Sterling looked at Elias with a look of pure, concentrated pity. "Go home at 5, Elias. Don't let the door hit your sextant on the way out." Elias Thorne didn't argue. He didn't show the fury that was a white-hot coal beneath his ribs. He didn't tell them that he was the man who had written the sequence they were so proudly misinterpreting. He simply turned and walked back to his cluttered desk in the corner. He sat down. He opened his leather-bound logbook to a blank page. He didn't look at the holographic display. He looked at the raw telemetry data in the corner of the room's smallest monitor. He picked up a pencil and began to manually calculate the drift. He was the navigator in the shadows, performing the thorn sequence by hand, using a pencil and a piece of paper to do what a $10 million AI was currently failing to see. Asterisk. Pressure, 1024 millibars. Ion density, 0.88 microns. Refractive index shift, 0.04 degrees. Asterisk. He watched the expert steer the ship directly into the digital eye of the storm. He saw the one variable they were never taught to see beginning to glow. The Azor's shimmer wasn't a jitter anymore. It was a rhythmic, pulsating warning. Elias checked his watch. 4:15 p.m. The thermal inversion was reaching its peak. The isotope shipment of $500 million lifeline for the National Health Authority was currently entering the heart of the refractive zone. Elias stood up, picked up his work jacket and walked toward the exit. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't offer a final warning. He had tried to give them the map and they had laughed at the rust on the compass as he stepped into the elevator. Elias looked back at the command center. Marcus was high-fiving David. Julian was checking his stock options. The green dot on the map was pulsating with a false sense of security. But Elias Thorne knew. He knew that in less than 6 hours, the North Atlantic was going to remind them that physics doesn't care about your Harvard degree. And when the noise finally stopped, they were going to find out that the Thorne sequence was never about the code. It was about the man who knew how to find the true north when the screens went black. Elias walked out into the cool evening air of the shipyard. He felt the weight of the $15,000 Maya needed, and he felt the weight of the disaster he knew was already in motion. The noise is about to stop. Marcus, he whispered to the saltwind. He headed for the bus stop. He had a daughter to feed, a sextant to polish, and a front row seat to the end of Julian Sterling's future. The 1:15 a.m. silence of the VDL Global Command Center was shattered not by an alarm, but by the sound of a system gasping for air. On the 40-foot obsidian wall screen, the steady, reassuring green pulse of the $500 million medical isotope shipment began to flicker. It didn't turn red. It didn't trigger a warning chime. It simply started to stutter, the icon jumping across the Atlantic map with a jagged, irregular rhythm. Telemetric variance detected. Simon whispered, his fingers flying across his tablet. Marcus's the Aegis model is losing the packet sync. We're getting a 60% drop in the primary telemetry bus. Marcus Thorne stood up, his face losing its clinical tan in the harsh blue light of the monitors. It's a signal hack. A rival firm is hitting the Azores relay with a localized jamming burst. David, initiate a full system reboot. Force the satellite handshake at triple gain. We need to punch through the noise. Elias Thorne was standing in the shadows of the back hallway, his hand resting on the frame of the server room door. He hadn't left at 5. He had stayed in the archives, working by the light of a single desk lamp, manually plotting the thermal inversion trajectory he knew was coming. He walked into the blue light of the command center. He didn't look at the panicked faces of the experts. He looked at the raw, unaugmented data feed on the smallest monitor of the one the Blackwood team had labeled legacy input. If you reboot the system now, Marcus, you're not punching through the noise, Elias said. His voice was a low, terrifying anchor in the mounting chaos. You're effectively blinding the only eyes you have left. Julian Sterling spun around, his silk trenchcoat flapping. He looked like a man who had just seen the ghost of his own bank account. Elias, what are you still doing here? Blackwood has this under control. It's a security breach. We're neutralizing the threat. It's not a security breach, Julian, Elias said, walking toward the center of the room. He didn't ask for permission to enter the circle. He moved with the heavy, unhurried authority of a man who owned the ground he stood on. There is no hacker. There is no threat. There is only physics. You're hitting the ion density spike I warned you about 10 hours ago. The thermal inversion has reached the 30,000-foot ceiling. Your satellite signal isn't being jammed. It's bending away from the relay. The Aegis model, says Marcus began, his voice cracking. The Aegis model is currently in a recursive parity loop, Elias roared, his voice finally breaking through the clinical silence. It's trying to find a digital answer to a physical problem. It's looking for a software handshake that can't happen because the medium itself has changed. If you force the gain now, the signal won't punch through. It will reflect back into the satellite's receiver. You'll fry the transponders. You'll effectively delete the tracking signature of the cargo. You'll be blind forever, and those isotopes will be radioactive waste by sunrise. Julian looked at Marcus, then at Elias. He saw the experts sweating, their slim-fit jackets looking like costumes. Then he looked at Elias, the man with the grease-stained collar and the steady eyes. The isotope pods, Julian gasped. The cooling sensors, ... If we lose the signature, we can't monitor the temperature. If you lose the signature, you lose the cargo, Elias said, and the National Health Authority loses a $500 million lifeline. Marcus slammed his tablet onto the console. He's guessing. He's using gut feelings and dockside superstitions. Simon, initiate the reboot. Now, that's a direct order from the lead consultant. Simon hesitated. His hand hovered over the red system reset toggle. He looked at the wall screen where the green dot was, now a frantic, dying spark. Marcus, Simon whispered, his eyes wide. The Thorn sequence. Look at the subroutine. It's flagging a physical occlusion error. It's exactly what he's describing. It's a Class 7 refraction event. Elias stepped forward. He didn't push Simon aside. He simply occupied the space. He reached out and placed his scarred hand over the keyboard. The Thorn sequence was never designed to save money, Marcus, Elias said, his voice dropping into a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate the floor. It was designed to protect people who have no other eyes. It was designed to trust the steel and the stars when the code fails. Elias began to type. He wasn't using the Blackwood interface. He was using a command line route access and navigator dialect that the junior experts had never seen in their textbooks. He was entering strings of code that bypassed the AI, the security gates, and the entire Blackwood optimization model. Wait, David gasped, leaning in toward the screen. That's a root-level architecture override. Only the original architect has those bypass codes. Only the man who wrote the kernel. He stopped. He looked at Elias's hands, the thick, calloused fingers moving with the speed of a concert pianist. Then he looked at Elias's face. You're using the Thornmaster sequence, Simon whispered. His voice hushed with a sudden, terrifying realization. But that's proprietary. That's the original VDL backbone. Who are you? Elias Thorn didn't look up. He reached into the inner pocket of his faded work jacket and pulled out a small, battered leather wallet. He flipped it open and slid it across. The glass console. Inside was a VDL identification badge from 20 years ago. The gold leaf lettering was faded, the edges were frayed, but the title was written in a font that had remained unchanged for 3 decades. *** Elias Thorn Global, Architect and Master Navigator. The room went dead silent. The experts stared at the badge as if it were a holy relic. They looked at Julian Sterling, whose mouth was hanging open. They looked at the man they had mocked as a relic, as deadwood, as part of the background noise. They realized they weren't standing in front of a fleet manager. They were standing in front of the man who had built the very ground they were standing on. They were standing in front of the genius whose textbooks they had memorized but whose fundamental laws they had just broken in the name of efficiency. You're Thorn, Marcus whispered, his voice a pathetic, thin sound. The Thorn. One variable you were never taught to see, Marcus, Elias said, his gaze fixed on the screen, is that the machine doesn't care about your PhD, it only cares about the truth. Elias hit the final execute key. On the wall screen, the flickering red spark stabilized. The handshake error vanished. The green dot over the mid-Atlantic turned a brilliant, steady, and undeniable green *** telemetry restored. Signal parity 100%. Cooling systems active. *** the $500 million medical isotope shipment was back on the map. The cargo was safe. The disaster had been averted by a man with a pencil and a 30-year-old memory. Julian Sterling leaned against the mahogany railing, his legs finally giving out. He looked at Elias Thorn, the man he had fired, the man he had ridiculed, the man who had just saved his empire with a grease-stained hand. Elias, Julian whispered, I didn't know. The records... They didn't say who built the sequence. I thought it was just a name. You didn't look, Julian, Elias said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the blue light. You were so busy looking for the future that you forgot to check who was holding up the floor. The turning point had arrived. The experts were now just observers in their own room. The relic was the only one with the map. And for Julian Sterling, the instant regret wasn't just a feeling. It was the realization that he had just fired the only man who could find the harbor in the dark. Elias Thorn picked up his thermos. He didn't look at the applause. He didn't look at the shocked faces of the Blackwood team. He looked at the green dot, thinking of Maya and the stars. The noise has stopped, Julian, Elias said. Now, let's talk about the price of the repair. The silence that followed the restoration of the signal was heavier than the panic that had preceded it. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just watched the impossible happen, and in doing so, realized that everything they thought they knew was a carefully constructed lie. Marcus Thorn stood frozen, his hand still hovering over a tablet that had become nothing more than a slate of useless glass. He looked at the wall screen, at the steady, pulsating green dot, and then at the man standing beside him. The experts from Blackwood were no longer the architects of the future. They were children who had been caught playing with a master's tools. How? Marcus whispered. His voice was no longer clinging with it was thin, shattered, stripped of the unearned authority it had carried since he walked through the VDL doors. The Aegis model said the signal was gone. It said the transponders were fried. You can't bypass a Class 7 encryption from a root. It's physically impossible. Elias Thorn didn't look at him. He didn't even look at Julian. He was focused on the scrolling white text of the root log, his fingers performing a final, mechanical check of the cooling sensors on the isotope pods. The Aegis model told you it was impossible because you taught it to ignore the medium, Elias said. His voice was a low-frequency anchor that seemed to ground the entire room. You were trying to send a digital packet through a physical wall of iron refraction. You were trying to speak a language the ocean doesn't understand. I didn't bypass your encryption, Marcus. I didn't even touch it. He looked up then, his reef blue eyes locking onto Marcus with a terrifying, calm intensity. I used the Thorn sequence as a kinetic beacon, Elias said. I didn't send a packet. I sent a physical vibration through the tether's internal steel core. I turned the entire ship into a low-frequency antenna. I didn't ask the satellite for permission to speak. I told it exactly where the ship was by using the Earth's own magnetic field. It's called kinetic parity. It's the first chapter of the textbook you claim to have memorized. But you skipped it, didn't you? Because it doesn't look good. On a spreadsheet, it involves rust. It involves the human element. Julian Sterling stepped forward. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His silk pajamas were visible beneath his trench coat, a stark reminder of how unprepared he was for the world he tried to command. He looked at Elias, the man he had called Deadwood, the man he had ridiculed for smelling of grisand, his face twisted into a mask of desperate, pathetic hope. Elias, Julian whispered, you saved it. 500 million. You saved the company. I don't know what to say, the board. They'll be ecstatic. We'll make sure they know you are the one. We'll make sure everyone knows. Julian turned to Marcus and his team, his voice snapping back into a jagged, defensive roar. And you, get out. All of you. Marcus, David, Simon, take your tablets. Take your Aegis model and get off my floor. You nearly bankrupted this empire for an efficiency bonus. You lied to me about the risks. You mocked the only man who actually knew how to fix your mistakes. If I see any of you in this industry again, I'll spend every penny of the sterling estate to make sure you're blacklisted from the docks to the desert. Out. The experts didn't argue. They didn't defend their model. They gathered their things in a frantic, accumulated blur and retreated toward the elevator, their heads down, their slim-fit jackets looking like costumes for a play that had just been cancelled. The room was empty now, save for Julian, Elias, and the junior technicians who were too afraid to move. Elias, Julian said, his voice softening, reaching for the corporate charm he had used to dismantle the company's history. I'm an operational man. I see results, and what I just saw, it was a revelation. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about the old guard. We need you, Elias, not as a consultant, not as a fleet manager. Julian stepped closer, his hand reaching out for Elias's shoulder, but Elias stepped back as subtle, final rejection. I'm appointing you Chief Operating Officer, Julian said, his eyes wide with a manic kind of relief. No better chief. Technology auditor, you'll have full oversight of the global grid. Name your salary. $1 million for housing allowance, a private jet for your daughter's doctor visits, whatever you want. Just stay, we need the navigator at the helm, Elias. Thorne looked at the holographic globe. He saw the green dot. He saw the architecture he had built 20 years ago to protect the woman he loved, the system he had named after Sarah. And then he thought of Maya, he thought of the cottage, the brass sextant, and the silence of the North Atlantic. He looked at Julian Sterling. He saw a boy who thought that loyalty could be bought with a title and a paycheck. A man who didn't understand that respect isn't earned in a boardroom, but in the heart of the storm. You don't want a navigator, Julian, Elias said quietly. You want a shield. You want someone to blame the next time your future hits a wall of physics. You want to buy my silence so the board doesn't find out that the man you fired is the only reason you're still standing. That's not true, Elias. You value the Thorn sequence, Elias interrupted, his voice dropping into the low-frequency rumble that cut through Julian's desperation. But you still don't understand what it is. It isn't a code, it isn't an algorithm, it's a promise that the man at the desk will never forget the man on the deck. And you broke that promise the second you looked at my daughter's invoice and saw it as a liability. Elias reached into his faded work jacket and pulled out a single, legal document. It wasn't an employment contract. It was a formal notice of intellectual property infringement. I spent 40 minutes in the archives tonight, Julian, Elias said. While your experts were trying to reboot the AI, I was reviewing the licensing agreements for the Aegis model. You acquired the kernel from a third-party vendor in Germany, but that vendor, they bought the code from a shell company that held the original Titan Dynamics patents. My patents? Julian froze. What? The Aegis model uses 47 of my proprietary root-level protocols for signal parity and kinetic grounding, Elias continued, his voice as cold as the deep water. Protocols that were never authorized for use in an automated environment. Protocols that were licensed specifically for manual override systems. By removing the signal buffers and automating the navigator method, you violated 47 international patents. You've been using my mind to build your empire, Julian, and you've been doing it without paying the rent. Elias slid the document across the console. The settlement fee for unauthorized use over the last 5 years, plus the royalty but for the next 10, is $10 million, Elias said. It's a fair price for a system that just saved you $500 million. Sign it, or I take the protocols down. And without those 47 lines of code, your AI is just a very expensive calculator that can't see past the next fog bank. Julian Sterling stared at the document. He looked at the $10 million figure, then at the green dot on the screen. He realized then that he wasn't just negotiating with a man he had fired. He was negotiating with a man who owned the very oxygen he was breathing. 10 million, Julian whispered. It's the price of the future you wanted, Julian, Elias said. One that doesn't include the friction of men like me. Pay it, and you keep the company. Don't pay it, and you can try and explain to the National Health Authority why their isotopes are hot and their CEO is in a patent lawsuit. He can't win. Julian didn't hesitate. He reached for a pen. He signed. He had no choice. The Ice Queen had been humbled, and the Navigator had just delivered the final lesson in logistics. Elias Thorne picked up the document. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't wait for a plaque. He picked up his battered thermos and walked toward the exit. Elias. Julian called out as the elevator doors began to close. What about the job? What about the coup position? We need you. Elias looked at the man who had replaced him with experts. He looked at the blue light of the command center, the cold, clinical world he had built and outgrown. The noise has stopped, Julian Elias said. Now, try to learn how to listen to the silence. It's the only thing that will save you. The next time the stars go black. The doors shut. Elias Thorne walked out of the glass cathedral of Vanguard Defense. He walked through the shipyard, the salt twined fresh against his face, the sound of the ocean finally drowning out the hum of the servers. He felt the weight of the $10 million in his pocket, and he felt the weight of the $15,000 Maya needed not just for this month, but for every month of her life. He wasn't a relic. He wasn't dead wood. He was a father who had just secured his daughter's breath, and for the first time in 30 years, Elias Thorne was truly home. The justice delivered at Vanguard Defense was as swift as it was absolute. Within an hour of the doors closing on the Blackwood consultants, their security clearances were revoked. Their company was served with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. The optimization experts weren't just fired, they were erased from the industry. Julian Sterling remained at the head of the company, but he was a man whose crown had been permanently tarnished. The board of directors, finally waking up to the reality of the disaster they had almost authorized, stripped Julian of his unilateral decision-making power. He was forced to reinstate the manual oversight protocols and the very navigator methods he had mocked as relics. He was still the CEO, but he was now a king who had to ask the commoners for permission to touch the wheel. 3 days later, the $10 million settlement hit Elias Thorne's account in a single, silent wire transfer. He didn't buy a mansion in the hills. He didn't buy a luxury car to park in the shipyard. He sat at his small kitchen table in the cedar cottage, looking at the number on his bank's mobile app. He reached out and paid the $15,000 medical invoice for Maya's specialized treatments for the next 10 years. He set up a trust fund that would ensure she never had to worry about the cost of her breath for the rest of her life. Elias walked out to his garage and looked at the brass sextant. He polished the arc until the light caught the etchings Sarah had loved. He wasn't a fleet manager anymore. He wasn't a consultant. He was a man who had fulfilled a promise. He received one final call from Julian Sterling, a voice stripped of its arrogance, sounding small and hollow. Elias, Julian said, the board may want to know if you'll come in for the quarterly review, just as a guest, to make sure we're on the right track. Elias looked at Maya, who was sitting on the porch, breathing the clean salt air without the hum of a machine. I'm busy, Julian, Elias said quietly. I have a lesson to teach. He hung up. The navigator was no longer watching the grid, was watching the stars. The afternoon sun was gold on the water as Elias and Maya sat on the deck of the Sarak. The small sailboat was a far cry from the glass spires of the VDL command center. But here, the air was clean, and the only rhythmic sound was the gentle lap of the tide against the hull. Maya was holding the brass sextant, her small hand steady as she found the horizon. She wasn't breathing through a mask. She was breathing the deep, salt-rich air of the North Atlantic. I found the North Star, Dad, she shouted, her voice clear and free of the wheeze that had haunted her childhood. Elias smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. He sat beside her, his scarred hand resting on the wooden tiller. The man who had traded the world's noise for a child's peace. Asterisk narrator. We live in a world that worships the new and mocks the old, forgetting that the foundation is what holds the spires. We are taught to listen to the loudest voices and the most polished algorithms, ignoring the quiet craftsmen who keep the world from sinking. But arrogance can buy an algorithm, and it can buy a suit, but it can never buy the soul of a navigator. Don't underestimate the man you replaced. You might just find out he's the one who gave you the map in the first place. Because when the storm hits and the screens go black, the only thing that matters is the true north. Elias Thorne looked at his stars and at the stars. He wasn't a relic. He was a father. He was a navigator. And for the first time in 30 years, the ocean felt like home.